The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the abandoned gas station like bullets, each drop echoing through the empty structure where David Martinez crouched behind an overturned vending machine. His weathered hands gripped a flashlight that cast dancing shadows across graffiti-covered walls, illuminating the scared face of his 12-year-old son Miguel, who pressed close against his father's shoulder. They had been driving through the disputed border region of San Cristobal when their truck broke down, forcing them to seek shelter in what had once been a thriving roadside stop, but now stood as a monument to a civil war that had torn the small Central American nation apart for over a decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David's calloused fingers traced the wedding ring he still wore 3 years after losing his wife Maria to the same conflict that had now stranded them in this forsaken place. As a logistics coordinator for international relief organizations, he had seen enough of war's aftermath to recognize the signs of recent violence in the bullet holes that punctured the station's walls, and the dark stains on the concrete floor that spoke of tragedies he preferred not to imagine. His son Miguel, wise beyond his years from growing up in a region where childhood ended early, understood the gravity of their situation without needing explanation. The sound that emerged from the darkness beyond the station's shattered windows was barely human, a whimper so faint that David initially mistook it for the wind whistling through the building's many gaps. But Miguel's sharp ears, trained by years of listening for sounds that might signal danger or salvation in their unpredictable world, caught something his father had missed. The boy tugged at David's sleeve and pointed toward a pile of debris in the far corner where twisted metal and broken glass created a natural shelter from the storm. David moved cautiously toward the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal what appeared to be a bundle of rags huddled against the wall. As he drew closer, the bundle stirred, and he realized with a shock that sent his heart racing that he was looking at a child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 15. Her military fatigues torn and stained with mud and blood, her face gaunt from hunger and marked by the premature aging that comes from witnessing horrors no young person should ever see. But it was her condition that made David's breath catch in his throat. Even in the dim light, he could see the unmistakable curve of advanced pregnancy straining against her camouflage shirt. The girl's dark eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, fixed on his face as she tried to scramble backward into the debris, one protective hand instinctively covering her swollen belly, while the other reached for something that might have been a weapon, but proved to be nothing more than a broken piece of concrete. David raised both hands in the universal gesture of peace, speaking in the gentle Spanish he had perfected during his years working with displaced families throughout the region. His voice carried the same soothing tone he had used to comfort Miguel during thunderstorms when the boy was younger, the same cadence that had calmed countless frightened refugees who had crossed his path in camps and shelters from Honduras to Nicaragua. The girl, for that's what she was despite the military uniform and the hardened expression she wore like armor, responded in halting Spanish mixed with indigenous phrases David couldn't understand. Her accent carried the musical quality of the mountain dialects, suggesting she had come from one of the remote villages where the government forces and rebel groups had been fighting their endless proxy war for control of mineral rights and drug trafficking routes. As David's eyes adjusted to the shadows, he began to make out more details of the girl's appearance that painted a picture of recent violence and desperate flight. Her left arm hung awkwardly at her side, clearly injured though she tried to hide her pain. Scratches covered her exposed skin, some fresh and still bleeding, others partially healed and speaking of weeks spent moving through hostile terrain. Her boots were held together with strips of fabric, and her uniform bore the insignia of one of the smaller rebel factions groups that David knew recruited children as young as 10 to serve as soldiers, messengers, and worse. Miguel, who had inherited his mother's natural empathy, along with her dark eyes and gentle spirit, approached slowly with a water bottle from their emergency supplies. The girl's suspicion warred with her obvious thirst as she watched the boy's careful movements. When Miguel set the bottle within her reach and backed away, she grabbed it with trembling hands and drank deeply, water spilling down her chin in her desperate haste. David found himself studying the girl's face, trying to estimate her age and circumstances while fighting down the surge of protective anger that rose in his chest whenever he encountered another child whose innocence had been stolen by adults playing deadly games with lives and borders. He had seen too many young soldiers over the years, encountered too many children forced to carry weapons instead of school books, witnessed too many families torn apart by conflicts they hadn't started and couldn't escape. The girl's pregnancy presented complications that went far beyond their current shelter situation. In a region where military checkpoints could mean death for suspected enemy combatants, where hospitals asked dangerous questions about patients with gunshot wounds, where even relief organizations struggled to maintain neutrality, a pregnant child soldier represented a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. David's mind raced through possibilities and obstacles, his experience with international law and refugee protocols warring with the immediate human need staring back at him from the darkness. As if sensing his thoughts, the girl spoke again, her voice stronger now that she had water. She pointed to herself and said what might have been her name, something that sounded like Esperanza, though David couldn't be certain through her thick accent and obvious exhaustion. When she gestured toward her belly and spoke again, David caught enough words to understand that she was perhaps 7 or 8 months along, dangerously close to term and clearly suffering from malnutrition and the physical stress of whatever journey had brought her to this abandoned place. The storm outside seemed to intensify as if the weather itself understood the gravity of their situation. Lightning illuminated the gas station's interior in stark, momentary clarity, revealing the full extent of the damage the building had sustained and the precarious nature of their temporary refuge. David made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives, though he couldn't have imagined the far-reaching consequences of what seemed like a simple act of human decency. He approached Esperanza slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening while speaking in soft, reassuring tones. Using a combination of Spanish and hand gestures, he tried to communicate his intentions, that he wanted to help, that she was safe with them, that they would not abandon her to face whatever dangers waited beyond the storm. Miguel, understanding his father's character better than anyone, began unpacking their emergency medical supplies and the extra blankets they carried for situations exactly like this. Esperanza's resistance gradually crumbled as exhaustion and pain overwhelmed her survival instincts. She allowed David to examine her injured arm, which proved to be dislocated rather than broken, a painful condition, but one he could treat with his basic medical training. As he worked to reset the joint, she gritted her teeth against the pain but made no sound, displaying the kind of stoic endurance that came from experiencing far worse injuries under much more dangerous circumstances. While David tended to Esperanza's physical wounds, Miguel created a more comfortable resting area using their camping gear and the cleanest debris he could find. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The boy worked with quiet efficiency, his movements displaying the kind of maturity that develops in children who have grown up in unstable environments. He had learned to read his father's moods and intentions, understanding without being told that this girl represented more than just another person seeking shelter from the storm. As the night wore on, Esperanza began to relax enough to share fragments of her story. Her words came in whispers, interrupted by long silences and moments when her eyes would lose focus as if she were seeing ghosts in the shadows. David pieced Together a narrative of forced recruitment, brutal training, and a recent battle that had scattered her unit and left her fleeing through the jungle for weeks. The father of her unborn child was another child soldier, killed in the same engagement, that had left her alone and pregnant in hostile territory. David's heart broke as he listened to this litany of suffering, recognizing in Esperanza's story the same patterns of exploitation and abandonment he had witnessed throughout his career in humanitarian work. But there was something different about this encounter, something that went beyond professional obligation or even personal compassion. Perhaps it was the way Miguel had immediately accepted their responsibility for this girl's welfare, or the way Esperanza's hand never left her belly, even when describing the worst of her experiences, protecting her unborn child even in sleep. The revelation of Esperanza's full situation came when she doubled over in sudden pain, gasping and clutching her stomach with both hands. David's limited medical knowledge was enough to recognize the signs of premature labor, and his panic was matched only by the grim understanding that they were hours away from the nearest medical facility and trapped by a storm that showed no signs of abating. The abandoned gas station, with its broken windows and bullet-scarred walls, would have to serve as a delivery room whether they were prepared for it or not. Miguel, displaying courage that reminded David powerfully of his late wife, took charge of boiling water and sterilizing their limited medical supplies, while his father tried to make Esperanza as comfortable as possible. The girl's labor progressed rapidly, perhaps hastened by the weeks of stress and poor nutrition she had endured. Between contractions, she grabbed David's hand with surprising strength and spoke urgently in her mountain dialect, switching to Spanish only when she saw his confusion. What she told him changed everything David thought he knew about their situation. Esperanza wasn't just another child soldier fleeing a lost battle. She was carrying information that could potentially end the conflict that had devastated the region for over a decade. Hidden in her uniform was a micro SD card containing evidence of war crimes committed by high-ranking officials on both sides of the conflict, documentation that international prosecutors had been seeking for years, testimony that could bring justice to thousands of victims and their families. The card had been given to her by a dying rebel commander who had realized that the war they were fighting was not about ideology or liberation, but about maintaining a profitable status quo that benefited corrupt leaders while destroying the lives of ordinary people caught in the crossfire. Esperanza had been chosen as the courier not because of her military skills, but because she was pregnant and therefore less likely to be thoroughly searched if captured. Her instructions were to deliver the evidence to a specific journalist in the capital, but the collapse of her unit had left her stranded and hunted by forces from both sides who would kill her and her unborn child to prevent the truth from emerging. As Esperanza's labor intensified, David found himself faced with responsibilities that extended far beyond providing shelter from a storm. He was now the protector of evidence that could reshape an entire nation's future, the guardian of a mother and child whose survival might determine whether justice would finally come to a region that had known only violence for too long. The weight of these revelations pressed down on him like the storm clouds overhead, but he had no time to fully process their implications. The baby arrived just before dawn, emerging into a world of broken glass and bullet holes, but welcomed with tears of joy and relief from all three of her unexpected guardians. Esperanza, exhausted but triumphant, cradled her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had fought literal battles to bring new life into existence. The infant's first cries echoed through the abandoned gas station like a declaration of hope in a place that had known only despair. David wrapped the newborn in the cleanest blanket they had while Miguel watched with wonder at this miracle of birth in the midst of destruction. The boy had never witnessed anything like this moment. The transformation of a desperate girl into a fierce mother, the emergence of innocent life from circumstances of unimaginable darkness, the way hope could literally take human form even in the most unlikely places. As morning light began to filter through the station's damaged roof, David realized that everything about their lives had changed in the space of a single night. They were no longer just travelers stranded by a storm, but witnesses to something larger than themselves, participants in a story whose ending had yet to be written. Esperanza looked up at him with eyes that held both gratitude and determination, and he saw in her expression the same quality that had drawn him to humanitarian work in the first place, the unshakable human conviction that tomorrow could be better than today if someone was willing to fight for that possibility. The storm had passed, but their journey was just beginning. David understood that they could not simply deliver Esperanza to the nearest refugee camp or hospital and walk away. Too many people were looking for her, too much depended on keeping her and her evidence safe until they could reach someone with the power and courage to act on what she carried. His background in logistics and international relief work had prepared him for complex operations under dangerous conditions, but nothing had prepared him for the personal transformation he felt as he looked at this new family that circumstance had thrust into his care. Miguel seemed to understand intuitively that their lives had taken an irreversible turn. The boy gathered their supplies with newfound purpose, his movements conveying an acceptance of whatever responsibilities lay ahead. He had grown up watching his father help strangers, had absorbed lessons about duty and compassion that were now being tested in ways Maria could never have imagined when she taught their son about standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. Esperanza named her daughter Luz Light, and as David helped her prepare for the journey ahead, he couldn't help but think that the name was prophetic. This child, born in a place of violence but welcomed with love, might indeed represent the light that could finally illuminate the darkness that had shrouded the region for too long. The evidence Esperanza carried could expose the corruption and war crimes that perpetuated the conflict, but it was the baby in her arms that gave David the courage to believe that change was actually possible. The abandoned gas station had served its purpose as both shelter and birthing room, but now it was time to leave. David's truck had been repaired during the night by Miguel, who had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude along with his mother's compassion. As they prepared to depart, David took one last look around the place where three strangers had become an unlikely family, where hope had literally been born from desperation, where a simple decision to offer shelter had set in motion events that might reshape a nation's destiny. He helped Esperanza and baby Luz into the truck's cab while Miguel secured their supplies in the back. The girl, now a mother, moved carefully but with determination, her injured arm in a makeshift sling but her eyes bright with purpose. She had survived battles and a dangerous labor, had protected both her child and evidence that could save thousands of other children from the fate she had endured. David found himself in awe of her strength and resolved to prove worthy of the trust she had placed in him. As they drove away from the gas station, David caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror and was surprised by what he saw. The man looking back at him carried himself differently than the one who had sought shelter from the storm just hours earlier. His shoulders were straighter despite the additional burden he now carried, his eyes clearer despite the sleepless night, his jaw set with a determination that reminded him of Maria during her final weeks when she had insisted on using her remaining time to teach Miguel everything she could about courage and compassion. The road ahead wound through mountains still shrouded in morning mist, leading toward a destination that remained uncertain but no longer seemed impossible to reach. David had spent his career moving supplies and coordinating logistics for relief operations, but now he understood that some missions transcended professional duty and became personal callings. Esperanza dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, baby Luz sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Miguel watched the passing landscape with the alertness of someone who understood they were traveling toward their destiny, rather than simply driving to their next destination. The evidence hidden in Esperanza's uniform might expose the war crimes and corruption that had perpetuated the conflict, But David knew that the real power of their mission lay in something more fundamental, the simple human decision to protect the vulnerable, to stand up for truth even when it was dangerous, to believe that one person's choice to help could create ripples that would eventually become waves of change. The storm that had brought them together was over, but the journey it had started was just beginning, and David Martinez, single father and humanitarian worker, found himself at the center of what might become the most important mission of his life. The safe house in San Miguel appeared unremarkable from the outside, a modest concrete building with faded blue paint and a small garden where tomatoes grew alongside struggling roses. David had contacted his former colleague, Rosa Delgado, through encrypted channels, knowing that her network of journalists and human rights activists represented their best hope of getting Esperanza's evidence to people who could act on it. Rosa had operated in the shadows for 15 years, documenting atrocities and protecting witnesses, while maintaining the delicate balance that kept her alive in a region where truth-tellers often disappeared without explanation. When Rosa opened the door to greet them, David was struck by how much she had aged since their last meeting 3 years earlier. The woman who had once fearlessly ventured into war zones now moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every decision might be their last. Her graying hair was pulled back severely, and her dark eyes held the wariness of someone who had seen too many friends and colleagues pay the ultimate price for their commitment to justice. The interior of the safe house reflected Rosa's professional paranoia and personal warmth in equal measure. Heavy curtains blocked the windows while family photographs lined the walls, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously protective and welcoming. Multiple communication devices occupied a corner desk, their screens displaying encrypted feeds from news sources around the world. Despite the security measures, the space felt lived in and comfortable, a sanctuary where threatened individuals could recover both physically and emotionally from their ordeals. Esperanza clutched baby Luz tightly as Rosa examined the micro SD card with equipment that could verify its authenticity without compromising its contents. The journalist's face grew increasingly grave as she scrolled through file names and metadata, recognizing locations and dates that corresponded to massacres she had investigated but never been able to prove. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized the significance of what Esperanza had risked everything to preserve. Miguel explored the safe house with the cautious curiosity of someone who had learned to adapt quickly to new environments. He discovered a small library filled with books in multiple languages, evidence of Rosa's international connections and the global scope of her work. Among the volumes were photo albums documenting relief efforts and human rights investigations spanning decades. Visual testimony to both the worst and best of human nature. David found himself studying Rosa's wall of photographs more carefully, recognizing faces of colleagues who had died pursuing stories that powerful people preferred to keep buried. Each image represented not just a life lost, but also a victory for those who profited from chaos and suffering. He understood that by bringing Esperanza here, he was placing Rosa in immediate danger, while simultaneously offering her the story that could justify every risk she had ever taken. The process of reviewing Esperanza's evidence took hours, during which Rosa's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement to determination. The files contained not just documentation of individual war crimes, but evidence of a systematic campaign to prolong the conflict for economic gain. Military commanders on both sides had been collaborating to maintain territorial disputes that provided cover for drug trafficking operations, while international mining companies had been funding weapons purchases to ensure continued instability that kept land prices low and regulatory oversight minimal. As Rosa worked, Esperanza shared more details of how she had come to possess such damning evidence. The rebel commander who had entrusted her with the files had been a former government soldier whose conscience had finally overcome his loyalty to corrupt superiors. He had spent months secretly documenting crimes committed by his own forces, before defecting to the rebels, only to discover that their leadership was equally compromised. His death during the battle that scattered Esperanza's unit had been no accident. He had been executed by fellow rebels who discovered his activities. The implications of this revelation sent shockwaves through David's understanding of the conflict he had been working around for years. Relief organizations like his own had been unknowingly serving the interests of those who perpetuated the very suffering they sought to alleviate. Food distributions and medical assistance had been manipulated to support military operations on both sides, while international aid money had been diverted to purchase weapons and fund paramilitary groups that terrorized civilian populations. Baby Luz slept peacefully through these discussions, oblivious to the fact that her very existence had become a symbol of hope in a situation that seemed designed to destroy hope. Esperanza watched over her daughter with fierce protectiveness, understanding that powerful people would not hesitate to harm an infant if doing so served their purposes. The young mother had aged years in the weeks since her unit's destruction, but holding her child seemed to restore some of the strength that violence had tried to steal from her. Rosa's analysis confirmed David's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy revealed in the files. The evidence implicated not just local military commanders, but government officials in 3 neighboring countries, international business leaders, and even mid-level bureaucrats in humanitarian organizations, who had been providing intelligence to armed groups. The network of corruption was so extensive that exposing it would require unprecedented cooperation between multiple news outlets and law enforcement agencies across several jurisdictions. The safe house suddenly felt less secure, as Rosa explained. The full implications of what they were dealing with. The people implicated in these files had resources and connections that made them extremely dangerous adversaries. They had demonstrated repeatedly that they would use any means necessary to protect their interests, from assassination and kidnapping to orchestrating military operations that claimed hundreds of civilian lives. By possessing this evidence, David, Miguel, Esperanza, and Baby Luz had all become targets. Miguel listened to these discussions with the solemnity of someone far older than his 12 years, asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of the gravity of their situation. He wanted to know how many people had died because of the conspiracy, how long it had been going on, and whether stopping it would really end the suffering he had witnessed throughout his childhood. His questions reminded David of Maria's analytical mind and her refusal to accept simple answers to complex problems. Rosa began making secure communications with colleagues around the world, building a coalition of journalists and investigators who could simultaneously publish the evidence in multiple countries. This coordination was essential because isolated reporting could be suppressed through legal challenges, economic pressure, or direct violence against individual news outlets. Only a synchronized international release could ensure that the truth would emerge, despite the inevitable attempts to silence it. The safe house filled with tension as Rosa's network confirmed their worst fears about the scope of opposition they would face. Intelligence sources indicated that multiple armed groups were already searching for Esperanza, having learned through their infiltration of humanitarian organizations that she had escaped with sensitive materials. Government forces had initiated a manhunt disguised as a search for missing soldiers, while international business interests were deploying private security firms to locate and eliminate the threat to their operations. David found himself questioning every decision that had brought them to this point, wondering whether his impulse to help a pregnant girl had doomed them all. But watching Esperanza nurse her daughter while Rosa worked to verify evidence that could save thousands of lives, he understood that some moral obligations transcended personal safety. Maria had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, and this situation demanded the kind of courage that defined a person's entire character. The breakthrough came when Rosa's international contacts confirmed that prosecutors in multiple countries were prepared to act immediately on the evidence, provided they could verify its authenticity and ensure the safety of key witnesses. The International Criminal Court had been building cases against several individuals named in the files, while national governments were facing increasing pressure to address corruption within their own military establishments. The timing was finally right for evidence of this quality to trigger real consequences rather than merely generating headlines that would quickly be forgotten. Esperanza's role in this process extended beyond simply providing evidence. She would need to testify about how she obtained the files and what she had witnessed during her time as a child soldier. This testimony would humanize the statistics and make the abstract concepts of war crimes tangible for international audiences. However, her safety during and after such testimony remained a significant concern, requiring witness protection arrangements that might separate her permanently from her homeland and culture. The discussions about Esperanza's future became increasingly complex as Rosa outlined the various options available to them. Seeking asylum in a European country would provide physical safety, but might limit the effectiveness of her testimony, while remaining in the region would maximize her impact as a witness, but expose her to constant danger. The decision would ultimately rest with Esperanza herself, but she was still a teenager struggling with the responsibilities of new motherhood while processing trauma that would challenge adults twice her age. Miguel surprised everyone by suggesting a solution that combined elements of all the options they had discussed. His proposal demonstrated strategic thinking that reminded David powerfully of Maria's ability to see connections that others missed. The boy suggested that they could use David's connections with international relief organizations to create a mobile protection arrangement that would keep Esperanza safe, while allowing her to travel to various countries to provide testimony and advocacy. David realized that his son's suggestion revealed a fundamental truth about their situation. They could not solve this problem by hiding or running away. The only path to real safety lay in complete exposure of the conspiracy, creating a situation where harming the witnesses would generate more attention than allowing them to live. This approach would require unprecedented courage from all of them, but it offered the possibility of not just survival, but meaningful change. Rosa's evaluation of Miguel's proposal revealed its sophisticated understanding of how international justice systems actually functioned. The boy had correctly identified that witness protection programs were often ineffective in cases involving international conspiracies because they relied on the same governmental systems that were often compromised by the criminal networks they were meant to combat. Mobile protection using humanitarian organizations would be more flexible and potentially more secure because it would operate outside traditional governmental channels. The implementation of this strategy would require David to transform his role from simple logistics coordinator to the leader of an unprecedented humanitarian protection mission. His years of experience working in conflict zones had given him the skills necessary for such an operation, but success would depend on his ability to build and maintain a coalition of international partners who shared his commitment to justice regardless of personal risk. Esperanza listened to these discussions with growing determination, understanding that her decision would affect not just her own future, but the fate of countless other children currently serving as soldiers in conflicts around the world. Her experience had shown her that the cycle of violence would continue until someone was brave enough to break it, and she was beginning to understand that her survival had given her both the opportunity and the responsibility to be that person. Baby Luz stirred in her mother's arms, and Esperanza looked down at her daughter with an expression that combined love, protectiveness, and resolve. She spoke quietly but firmly, declaring her intention to do whatever was necessary to ensure that Luz would grow up in a world where children were not forced to become soldiers. This simple statement transformed the abstract discussions about legal strategy and international cooperation into something deeply personal and immediately urgent. Rosa began implementing security protocols that would protect them during the preparation phase, while her international contacts finalized arrangements for coordinated publication and prosecution. The safe house became a command center where multiple operations were planned, simultaneously securing additional evidence, identifying cooperative witnesses, establishing communication networks that could not be infiltrated or disrupted by hostile forces, and creating backup plans for every conceivable emergency. David found himself adapting to leadership responsibilities he had never sought, but was uniquely qualified to handle. His experience coordinating complex relief operations in hostile environments had prepared him for the logistical challenges they faced, while his personal investment in protecting Esperanza and baby Luz gave him the emotional strength necessary to make difficult decisions under extreme pressure. Miguel became his trusted lieutenant, handling communication tasks and security monitoring with competence that amazed the adults around him. The safe house began receiving visitors as Rosa's network expanded to include the coalition of journalists, prosecutors, and human rights activists who would be essential to their success. Each new arrival brought additional expertise, but also increased their security risks, forcing them to balance the need for collaboration against the imperative of maintaining operational security. David found himself making decisions about whom to trust with information that could literally determine whether they lived or died. Esperanza used this preparation time to document her own experiences more thoroughly, working with Rosa to create a comprehensive account of her recruitment, training, and service as a child soldier. This testimony would complement the technical evidence on the micro SD card by providing personal context that would make the crimes real for international audiences. Her descriptions of forced recruitment tactics, brutal training methods, and the systematic exploitation of children revealed the human cost of the conspiracy in terms that transcended abstract legal categories. The arrival of Dr. Elena Santos, a pediatric psychologist specializing in treating child soldiers, marked a turning point in their preparation. Dr. Santos had worked with hundreds of young people recovering from military trauma, and her expertise would be essential in ensuring that Esperanza could testify effectively without re-traumatizing herself. Her presence also provided additional credibility for their operation, as her reputation in international human rights circles was unassailable. Dr. Santos's initial evaluation of Esperanza revealed both the depth of her trauma and the remarkable resilience that had enabled her survival. The young mother had developed coping mechanisms that allowed her to function despite experiencing horrors that would devastate most adults, but she would need ongoing support to process her experiences in healthy ways. Baby Luz represented both a source of healing for her mother and a powerful motivation for recovery and growth. The psychological preparation for testimony proved as complex as the legal and security arrangements, requiring careful balance between helping Esperanza process her trauma and ensuring that she could communicate her experiences clearly to international audiences. Dr. Santos worked with her to develop techniques for managing flashbacks and emotional overwhelm while maintaining access to the memories that would make her testimony compelling and credible. Miguel's relationship with Esperanza evolved during this period as they discovered shared experiences of loss and resilience. Both had lost parents to violence, both had been forced to mature beyond their years, and both understood that their survival carried obligations to those who had not been as fortunate. Their growing friendship provided emotional support for both of them, while also giving David insights into how children could heal from trauma when provided with safety and understanding. The safe house became a temporary home where an unlikely family continued to form despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. David watched Miguel teaching baby Luz to grasp his finger while Esperanza practiced her testimony with Dr. Santos, and he understood that they had created something precious in the midst of chaos. Whatever happened next, they had proven that Human connection could flourish even in the darkest situations. Rosa's coordination with international partners reached a critical phase as publication dates were established and legal proceedings were scheduled across multiple jurisdictions. The synchronized nature of these actions was essential, because the conspiracy's reach meant that isolated efforts could be neutralized through political pressure, economic coercion, or direct violence. Only a coordinated international response could overcome the resources and connections that protected the criminal network. The final preparations required David to make decisions that would permanently alter his relationship with the relief organization that had employed him for over a decade. His superiors could not be informed about their operation because the files revealed that several international humanitarian organizations had been infiltrated by intelligence operatives working for the conspiracy. This meant that David would be operating without official sanction and potentially in violation of policies that governed international relief work. Esperanza's growing confidence in her role as a witness transformed not just her own demeanor, but the entire atmosphere of their operation. She began to see herself not as a victim seeking protection, but as someone with the power to create change, and this shift in perspective affected everyone around her. Her determination to ensure that baby Luz would grow up in a more just world became the emotional foundation that held their coalition together despite the enormous risks they were facing. The safe house filled with the tension of impending action as final security. Sweeps were conducted and communication protocols were tested. Everyone understood that once they began the coordinated release of evidence and testimony, there would be no turning back. Their enemies would respond with everything at their disposal, and survival would depend on the strength of the international coalition they had built and their ability to maintain operational security under extreme pressure. David looked around the room at the people who had become his extended family over the past weeks. Rosa with her decades of experience fighting for truth, Dr. Santos with her commitment to healing traumatized children, Miguel with his remarkable maturity and loyalty, Esperanza with her courage and determination, and baby Luz who represented hope for a better future. Tomorrow they would begin an operation that could reshape the political landscape of an entire region. But tonight they were simply people who cared about each other, preparing to risk everything for justice. The first indication that their careful plans were unraveling came at dawn when Rosa's monitoring equipment detected unusual radio chatter from military units that should have been stationed hundreds of kilometers away. David jerked awake to find her hunched over multiple screens, her face pale as she tracked movement patterns that suggested coordinated search operations converging on their general area. The encryption algorithms that protected their communications had been compromised, and hostile forces were systematically eliminating safe houses throughout the region. Esperanza sat feeding baby Luz in the kitchen when Rosa burst in with urgent whispers about immediate evacuation. The young mother's hands never trembled as she gathered her daughter's few possessions, but David saw in her eyes the haunted look of someone who had experienced too many sudden departures from places that had briefly felt like home. Miguel moved through the house with practiced efficiency, his movements betraying none of the fear that David knew must be coursing through him. The escape route Rosa had prepared led through a network of underground tunnels that connected several buildings in the neighborhood, remnants of an earlier conflict when civilians had needed hidden pathways to avoid military patrols. The tunnels were narrow and poorly ventilated, forcing them to move in single file while carrying their essential equipment and baby Luz through passages that hadn't been maintained in years. Water dripped constantly from deteriorating concrete. Overhead, and their flashlights revealed walls covered with graffiti in multiple languages, left by previous refugees who had used these same routes to flee various forms of persecution. Dr. Santos had remained behind to destroy sensitive materials and create false trails that might confuse their pursuers, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on David's conscience as they navigated the underground. Mays. Her expertise in trauma psychology had made her invaluable to their mission, but her absence left Esperanza without the professional support she needed during what was becoming an increasingly stressful situation. The young mother held baby Luz close to her chest, whispering soothing words in her indigenous dialect, while David tried to project calm confidence he didn't feel. The tunnels emerged in the basement of an abandoned textile factory where Rosa's contacts had prepared emergency transportation. 3 motorcycles waited with enough fuel to reach the mountain village where another safe house had been established. But the journey would require traveling through territory controlled by various armed groups who might recognize Esperanza or detect the valuable equipment they carried. David found himself making rapid decisions about which supplies to abandon and which were essential for their survival, each choice potentially determining whether they lived or died in the hours ahead. Miguel insisted on riding with the equipment, while David carried Esperanza and baby Luz, arrangement that terrified David, but represented their best chance of maintaining mobility if they encountered hostile forces. The boy had learned to handle motorcycles during their various relief missions, and his smaller size made him less likely to be spotted by aerial surveillance that Rosa's intelligence sources indicated was being deployed against them. Esperanza wrapped baby Luz in layers of cloth that would muffle any sounds while providing protection against the mountain cold they would encounter at higher elevations. The ride through contested territory became a nightmare of close calls and desperate improvisation as they encountered multiple checkpoints that hadn't appeared on Rosa's intelligence reports. David's experience in conflict zones served them well as he identified which roadblocks were manned by government forces versus rebel groups versus criminal organizations that served whoever paid them best. Each encounter required split-second decisions about whether to attempt passage through official channels, seek alternate routes that might be monitored, or hide until patrols moved on to other areas. At one particularly dangerous checkpoint, they were forced to abandon the motorcycles and continue on foot through dense forest that provided cover, but slowed their progress dramatically. Baby Luz began crying from hunger and discomfort, creating a security risk that could attract attention from any patrols within hearing distance. Esperanza's military training helped her navigate the terrain while carrying her daughter, but David could see exhaustion taking its toll on someone who was still recovering from childbirth and the trauma of recent combat. Miguel's resourcefulness proved crucial when they discovered that the safe house in the mountain village had been destroyed in what appeared to be a targeted airstrike. The building was still smoldering when they arrived, and evidence suggested that Rosa's contact there had been killed while trying to evacuate sensitive materials. This discovery forced them to confront the reality that their enemies possessed intelligence capabilities that exceeded anything they had anticipated, making traditional safe house networks unreliable for their protection. The village itself showed signs of recent military activity, with houses damaged by gunfire and residents too frightened to emerge from their homes, even during daylight hours. David understood that their presence was putting innocent civilians at risk, but they had nowhere else to go as night fell and baby Luz needed shelter from mountain temperatures that could prove fatal to an infant. An elderly woman finally emerged from her damaged home and gestured for them to follow her to a hidden cellar where her family had survived previous raids. The cellar contained 3 generations of the woman's family who had been hiding for weeks, as various armed groups fought for control of supply routes that passed through their village. Children as young as 5 years old demonstrated the kind of alertness that came from living under constant threat, while elderly grandparents shared their meager food supplies with strangers who had brought additional danger to their already precarious situation. David felt overwhelming guilt about involving innocent people in their mission, but the family's matriarch insisted that protecting witnesses to atrocities was a moral obligation that transcended personal safety. Esperanza's interaction with the hidden family revealed new dimensions of her character as she helped care for the younger children while sharing her own experiences as someone who had survived military recruitment and exploitation. Her stories about escape and resistance inspired hope among people who had begun to believe that their suffering would never end, while her presence with baby Luz demonstrated that new life and possibilities could emerge even from the darkest circumstances. The family's eldest son, barely 14 years old, listened with particular intensity to her accounts of how child soldiers could break free from the cycle of violence that had trapped them. Communication with Rosa and their international contacts became increasingly difficult as their enemies demonstrated sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities that could intercept or block satellite communications across wide areas. David found himself relying on old-fashioned methods like written messages carried by local children who could move through the countryside without attracting the attention that adults would draw from military patrols. These communication delays made coordinating their next moves nearly impossible while their enemies continued to close in on their location. The breakthrough that saved them came from an unexpected source when Miguel established contact with a network of young people who had been using social media and gaming platforms to share information about military movements in their area. These teenagers had developed their own intelligence gathering system that was invisible to adult authorities who underestimated young people's ability to organize and communicate effectively. Through encrypted messages hidden in seemingly innocent online games, they learned that a major military operation was planned for their village within the next 24 hours. David realized that their only chance of survival lay in completely abandoning the established safe house network and creating new protection arrangements using resources that their enemies wouldn't anticipate. His background in logistics gave him insights into how large organizations thought and operated, allowing him to identify blind spots in their enemies' surveillance capabilities. The solution he developed involved using legitimate humanitarian operations as cover for their movement, a strategy that would require convincing international relief organizations to risk their own operations by providing assistance without full knowledge of whom they were helping. The family hiding them in the cellar possessed detailed knowledge of mountain paths that had been used for generations to move goods and people without detection by various authorities. These routes were too treacherous for military vehicles, but could be navigated by people on foot who understood the terrain and weather patterns. The family's teenage son volunteered to guide them through passes that would bring them to a different region where David's professional contacts might be able to provide assistance without knowing the full scope of what they were involved in. Esperanza's military training became essential as they planned their mountain crossing, her knowledge of navigation and survival techniques complementing the local guide's familiarity with specific trails and hazards. She had recovered much of her strength in the days since giving birth, but carrying baby Luz through high-altitude terrain would test her endurance while exposing her daughter to environmental risks that could prove fatal. Dr. Santos had provided basic medical supplies before they separated, but treating serious altitude sickness or hypothermia would require resources they couldn't carry. The night before their departure, David found himself unable to sleep as he contemplated the magnitude of risks they were about to undertake. They would be traveling through territory where rescue would be impossible if someone was injured, where weather could change rapidly enough to trap them in deadly storms, where a single mistake in navigation could lead them into the hands of hostile forces, or over cliffs that would kill them all. His responsibility for Miguel's safety warred with his commitment to protecting Esperanza and baby Luz, creating emotional conflicts that had no satisfactory resolution. Miguel seemed to sense his father's internal struggle and approached him with the kind of mature conversation that reminded David powerfully of Maria's ability to see through surface concerns to underlying truths. The boy understood that their mission had evolved beyond simple witness protection into something that could affect the lives of thousands of children currently suffering in conflicts throughout the region. his willingness to accept dangerous conditions in service of this larger purpose both inspired and terrified David, who recognized his son's courage while wishing he could protect him from such heavy responsibilities. The departure from the village required careful timing to avoid patrols, while taking advantage of weather conditions that would provide natural camouflage for their movement. A thick fog that rolled in just before dawn created perfect cover for the first phase of their journey, but it also made navigation more difficult and increased the risk of accidents on narrow mountain paths. Their teenage guide moved with the confidence of someone who had traveled these routes many times, but David worried about what would happen if they became separated, or if the boy was injured during their crossing. Baby Luz's needs added complexity to every aspect of their journey as Esperanza struggled to maintain her milk supply, while dealing with the physical stress of high-altitude hiking and the emotional strain of constant vigilance against discovery. The infant's cries could attract attention from patrol aircraft or ground forces, forcing them to time their movement around her feeding and sleeping patterns in ways that might not align with optimal travel conditions. David found himself carrying additional weight and supplies needed for baby care, while trying to maintain the mobility necessary for rapid movement when circumstances required it. The mountain crossing revealed the full scope of environmental destruction caused by the prolonged conflict as they passed through areas where forests had been cleared to deny cover to enemy forces and where chemical weapons had left lasting damage to soil and water sources. Miguel documented these environmental crimes with a small camera, understanding that evidence of ecological warfare would strengthen the legal cases being prepared by international prosecutors. His scientific mind processed the connections between environmental destruction and human suffering in ways that would make his documentation particularly valuable for future accountability efforts. Their first night in the mountains tested everyone's endurance as temperatures dropped below freezing and wind threatened to blow them off narrow ledges where they sought shelter. Esperanza's military survival training helped her create insulated sleeping arrangements for baby Luz using materials they carried, but the infant's exposure to such harsh conditions worried David as he watched for signs of hypothermia or altitude sickness. Their teenage guide shared his family's traditional knowledge about mountain survival, including techniques for finding water and identifying edible plants that could supplement their limited food supplies. The second day brought clear skies that provided spectacular views of the surrounding countryside, but also made them visible to aerial surveillance that they knew was searching for them. They were forced to travel during daylight hours because the mountain paths were too dangerous for night movement, creating a constant tension between the need for speed and the requirement for concealment. David found himself making continuous risk assessments about which exposure was more dangerous while their guide led them through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate safely. Contact with the outside world remained impossible due to their remote location and the sophisticated jamming capabilities their enemies had deployed throughout the region. David's inability to communicate with Rosa or their international contacts meant that he had no way of knowing whether their coordinated publication plans were proceeding or whether their allies had also been compromised. The isolation forced him to accept that they might be entirely on their own for an indefinite period, dependent solely on their own resources and the kindness of strangers who had no obligation to help them. The third day brought a crisis when baby Luz developed symptoms that suggested altitude sickness, combined with dehydration from Esperanza's inability to maintain adequate milk production under extreme stress. Their limited medical supplies included nothing appropriate for treating an infant with these conditions, and the nearest medical facility was dozens of kilometers away through territory controlled by hostile forces. David found himself facing the possibility that their mission might cost baby Luz her life, an outcome that would destroy Esperanza and undermine everything they were trying to accomplish. Their teenage guide surprised them by revealing that his grandmother possessed traditional healing knowledge that might help baby Luz if they could reach her village without being detected by military patrols. This option required deviating from their planned route through territory that might be more heavily monitored, but the alternative was watching an innocent infant suffer potentially fatal complications while they remained helpless to provide effective treatment. Esperanza's desperation to save her daughter overrode security considerations, and she insisted they take whatever risks were necessary to reach medical assistance. The village they finally reached existed in a state of cautious neutrality that had protected it from the worst violence of the recent conflict. The inhabitants had survived by providing services to all armed groups while avoiding permanent alliances that might make them targets when military fortunes shifted. Their healer was an elderly woman whose knowledge combined traditional indigenous medicine with modern techniques she had learned during decades of treating injuries and illnesses that couldn't be addressed through official medical channels. Baby Luz's treatment required several days of care that allowed the adults to rest and recover their strength while planning their next moves. The village's isolation provided temporary security, but David understood that their presence was putting innocent people at risk if their enemies discovered their location. The healer's success in treating baby Luz created a debt that David felt obligated to repay, but the resources available to him were limited to knowledge and future promises rather than immediate material assistance. During their recovery period, Esperanza began working with the village women to document their experiences of conflict's impact on families and children. These testimonies would complement her own story by providing broader context about how military operations affected civilian populations, particularly women and children who were often overlooked in official accounts of violence. The women's stories revealed patterns of systematic abuse that supported the legal theories being developed by international prosecutors, while also demonstrating the resilience of communities that refused to be destroyed by forces beyond their control. Miguel's relationship with the village children provided David with insights into how young people process trauma and found hope despite overwhelming circumstances. The boy's natural empathy and intelligence made him an effective communicator with children who had experienced horrors similar to those Esperanza had endured, and his documentation of their stories would prove valuable for future healing and accountability efforts. David watched his son mature rapidly through these interactions while worrying about the emotional burden Miguel was accepting by witnessing such suffering. The news that finally reached them through the village's limited communication channels was both encouraging and terrifying. Rosa and their international contacts had successfully initiated the coordinated publication of evidence from the micro SD card, triggering investigations and arrests across multiple countries. However, the powerful forces implicated in the crimes had responded with unprecedented violence, including attacks on news outlets and the assassination of several journalists who had participated in the coordinated reporting effort. David realized that their mission had succeeded in exposing the conspiracy, but had also transformed them into permanent targets who could never return to their previous lives. The evidence they had helped reveal was making a difference in international courts and legislative bodies, but the personal cost of their success was higher than anyone had anticipated. Esperanza and baby Luz could never safely return to their homeland, while David and Miguel faced the prospect of permanent exile from the region where they had spent their entire lives. The village healer's wisdom helped them process the magnitude of changes their mission had created while planning for an uncertain future that would require completely rebuilding their lives in new locations. Her traditional knowledge about healing trauma and building resilience would prove as valuable as her medical treatment of baby Luz, providing psychological foundations that would help them survive the emotional challenges of displacement and continued threats to their safety. Their time in the mountain village ended when intelligence reached them that military forces were conducting systematic searches of remote communities in their region. The brief sanctuary they had found was about to be compromised, forcing them to move again despite baby Luz's recent illness and their own exhaustion from weeks of constant stress and physical hardship. The village's protection had allowed them to recover their strength and plan their next steps, but the outside world was closing in on their temporary refuge. The warehouse that served as their final hiding place smelled of rust and decay, its cavernous interior filled with abandoned shipping containers that created a maze of potential escape routes and hiding spots. David crouched behind a stack of corroded metal drums, holding his breath as helicopter rotors thundered overhead, their searchlights cutting through gaps in the damaged roof like mechanical lightning. Esperanza pressed herself against a concrete pillar with baby Luz clutched to her chest, the infant somehow sensing the danger and remaining silent despite the terrifying noise surrounding them. Miguel had positioned himself near a broken window that provided visibility of the approaches to their building, his young face set with determination that reminded David painfully of Maria during her final weeks when she had refused to show fear despite knowing her battle was nearly over. The boy's binoculars tracked movement patterns of the soldiers surrounding their location, his whispered reports providing tactical intelligence that their adult companions relied upon for survival. The siege had begun at dawn when military units from 3 different factions had simultaneously converged on the industrial district, where Rosa's emergency contacts had hidden them. The coordination between supposedly hostile forces confirmed their worst fears about the conspiracy's reach. Government troops, rebel fighters, and international mercenaries were all working together to eliminate witnesses who threatened their profitable war. David watched through scope lenses as soldiers who should have been shooting each other instead shared cigarettes and communication equipment. Rosa's laptop displayed incoming messages from around the world as their international coalition responded to the crisis. News outlets were preparing emergency broadcasts about the persecution of witnesses, while human rights organizations mobilized diplomatic pressure on governments that might be able to intervene. But David understood that political solutions would take time they didn't have, and rescue operations would be impossible given the military resources deployed against them. Dr. Santos had rejoined them during the night, slipping through enemy lines with intelligence that chilled David's blood. The conspiracy's response to their evidence had exceeded all expectations in its scope and brutality. Journalists who had participated in the coordinated publication were disappearing across multiple continents, while their families received death threats that demonstrated unprecedented international reach. The criminal network they had exposed was fighting for its survival with resources that included elements within legitimate government and business organizations. The psychological pressure of prolonged siege was taking its toll on everyone. But Esperanza showed remarkable resilience as she continued caring for baby Luz while helping plan their desperate escape attempts. Her military training had prepared her for extended combat situations, but David worried about the emotional impact on someone so young who had already endured more trauma than most adults could survive. Dr. Santos worked quietly with her during brief calm periods, providing therapeutic support that would be essential for long-term healing regardless of whether they survived their current predicament. Baby Luz had become a symbol of hope that kept their small group focused on survival rather than despair. The infant's presence reminded them that their mission extended beyond personal survival to protecting future generations from the violence that had shaped their own lives. Esperanza's fierce devotion to her daughter provided emotional strength that inspired the adults around her, while baby Luz's innocent trust in their protection created obligations that none of them would abandon regardless of personal cost. The first breakthrough in their siege came when Miguel discovered that the warehouse's industrial ventilation system connected to other buildings in the complex. His small size and mechanical aptitude made him the only one capable of exploring these passages to determine whether they offered escape routes that adult soldiers couldn't follow. David's terror at sending his son into unknown dangers was overwhelmed by the recognition that Miguel might be their only hope for avoiding capture or death. Communications with their international supporters became increasingly crucial as media attention focused global scrutiny on their situation. Rosa's contacts had transformed their desperate hiding into an international incident that was generating diplomatic pressure on multiple governments simultaneously. The conspiracy's attempt to eliminate witnesses was backfiring by creating exactly the kind of public attention that its members had spent years avoiding through violence and intimidation. The warehouse siege revealed the true scope of their enemies. Resources as surveillance equipment demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of most national militaries. Thermal imaging tracked their movements through walls, while electronic warfare systems jammed their communications and disrupted the industrial equipment that might have provided cover for escape attempts. David realized they were facing opposition that had access to cutting-edge military technology typically reserved for major international conflicts. Esperanza's knowledge of military tactics proved invaluable as she analyzed enemy positions and identified weaknesses in their encirclement. Her experience as a child soldier had taught her to observe details that adult commanders often overlooked, particularly regarding how different military units coordinated their operations. She noticed communication patterns that suggested tensions between the various factions surrounding them, conflicts that might be exploited to create opportunities for escape. Dr. Santos's presence provided psychological stability that kept their group functioning effectively under extreme stress. Her expertise in trauma response helped everyone process their fear and anger in ways that maintained operational effectiveness rather than surrendering to panic or despair. She worked particularly closely with Miguel, ensuring that his exposure to violence didn't overwhelm his natural resilience or permanently damage his emotional development. The international media response exceeded anything David had imagined possible when he first decided to help a pregnant girl seeking shelter from a storm. News broadcasts were featuring their story alongside analysis of the broader conspiracy they had exposed, while social media campaigns were generating global support for their protection. Their personal crisis had become a catalyst for international accountability, efforts that were already producing arrests and investigations across multiple continents. Miguel's exploration of the ventilation system revealed connections to a network of underground passages that had been used for smuggling operations during earlier phases of the conflict. These tunnels were dangerous and partially flooded, but they offered potential escape routes that wouldn't be monitored by the sophisticated surveillance systems deployed above ground. The discovery gave them their first realistic hope for survival, while also presenting new risks that could prove just as deadly as remaining trapped in the warehouse. The decision to attempt escape through the underground passages required careful planning that balanced speed against security considerations. Baby Luz's needs would make their movement slower and more difficult to conceal, while Dr. Santos's lack of military training might make her a liability during the dangerous journey ahead. David found himself making impossible choices about whom to protect and how to maximize their chances while accepting that not everyone might survive the attempt. Esperanza's preparation for the escape demonstrated leadership, qualities that had been forged through her experiences as a child soldier, but refined by her responsibilities as a mother. She organized their limited supplies with military efficiency while ensuring that baby Luz would have everything necessary for survival during what might be days of underground travel. Her ability to remain calm under pressure provided stability that helped the adults function effectively despite their terror. The underground escape began during a diversionary attack that Rosa's international contacts had arranged through sympathetic military units from a neighboring country. Artillery bombardment targeted enemy positions surrounding the warehouse, creating enough confusion to mask their entry into the tunnel system while drawing attention away from their actual escape route. David felt guilt about the soldiers who were dying to provide their diversion, but he understood that the evidence they carried was worth protecting at almost any cost. The tunnels proved even more treacherous than Miguel's reconnaissance had suggested, with unstable sections that threatened collapse and flooded areas that required swimming while carrying essential equipment. Baby Luz's cries echoed through the passages in ways that might attract attention from any pursuers who discovered their escape route, forcing Esperanza to time their movement around her daughter's needs while maintaining the speed necessary for successful evasion. Dr. Santos struggled with the physical demands of underground travel, but demonstrated courage that impressed everyone as she pushed through exhaustion and claustrophobia to keep pace with their desperate flight. Her medical knowledge proved essential when Miguel suffered a minor injury that could have become infected without proper treatment, while her psychological expertise helped everyone process the trauma of their narrow escape from almost certain death. The tunnels eventually emerged in a drainage system that connected to the river, running through the city's industrial district. This waterway offered transportation that would be difficult for their enemies to monitor, but it also exposed them to new dangers, including contamination from industrial chemicals and the possibility of drowning if they were swept into rapids or waterfall areas downstream. Their emergence from underground coincided with an international diplomatic intervention that had been triggered by global media coverage of their siege. Multiple governments were demanding explanations for military operations that appeared to target humanitarian workers and witnesses to war crimes, while international courts were issuing emergency protective orders that carried significant legal weight. The conspiracy they had exposed was facing the kind of sustained international pressure that its members had successfully avoided for years. Rosa's communication network had evolved into an international operation that was coordinating media coverage, diplomatic pressure, and legal proceedings across multiple time zones simultaneously. Her expertise in investigative journalism had made her invaluable for managing information flows that kept global attention focused on their situation while also protecting operational details that could compromise their safety. David realized that their personal crisis had become the catalyst for a massive accountability effort that extended far beyond their original mission. The river journey tested everyone's endurance as they navigated currents that could easily drown anyone who fell into the water while avoiding bridges and populated areas where they might be spotted by hostile forces. Esperanza's military survival training helped her improvise flotation devices and navigation techniques using materials they found along the riverbank, while Miguel's mechanical skills proved useful for repairing equipment that had been damaged during their underground escape. Baby Luz's condition became a constant concern as exposure to cold water and contaminated air took its toll on her infant immune system. Dr. Santos used her medical knowledge to monitor the baby's health while providing treatment using supplies they had managed to salvage from their various hiding places. The infant's survival became a measure of their mission's success, representing hope for future generations who might be spared the violence that had shaped their own lives. The international response to their crisis revealed both the power and limitations of global accountability mechanisms when confronted with well-organized criminal networks. Media attention and diplomatic pressure were generating significant political costs for governments that had enabled the conspiracy, but translating this pressure into effective protection for witnesses required coordination between institutions that often worked at cross purposes. David's transformation from logistics coordinator to the leader of an international protection mission reflected changes that none of them had anticipated. When they first took shelter from a storm in an abandoned gas station, his decisions were now affecting diplomatic relations between multiple countries, while influencing legal proceedings that could reshape international law regarding war crimes and corporate accountability. Miguel's documentation efforts had evolved from simple record keeping into a comprehensive archive that was being used by prosecutors and historians working to understand the full scope of the conspiracy they had exposed. His photographs and videos provided evidence that complemented the technical files on Esperanza's micro SD card, creating a complete picture of how corruption and violence had been systematically employed to maintain profitable conflicts. The river journey eventually brought them to a region where sympathetic military units had established a protective perimeter under international oversight. These forces represented multiple countries that had committed to witness protection. As part of broader accountability efforts triggered by the global media attention surrounding their case, David felt overwhelming relief at finally reaching safety, while also understanding that their ordeal had permanently changed everyone involved. Esperanza's reunion with baby Luz in a secure medical facility demonstrated the healing power of safety and proper care after weeks of constant danger and deprivation. The young mother's strength had never faltered during their escape, but seeing her daughter receive proper medical attention finally allowed her to show the vulnerability that military training had taught her to hide. Dr. Santos worked with both mother and infant to address trauma that would require ongoing attention for years to come. The secure compound where they were eventually housed represented an unprecedented international effort to protect witnesses whose testimony could reshape legal understanding of modern warfare and corporate accountability. Representatives from multiple human rights organizations and international courts had collaborated to create a protection program that could serve as a model for future cases involving transnational criminal networks. David found himself adapting to new responsibilities as his experience became valuable for developing protection protocols that could help other witnesses facing similar threats. His transformation from someone who simply provided logistic support to relief operations into a leader who could coordinate complex international operations reflected skills he hadn't known he possessed until circumstances demanded their development. The international media coverage of their escape had generated global support for accountability efforts, while also revealing the scope of opposition they continued to face. Death threats were arriving from multiple sources, while sophisticated propaganda campaigns were attempting to discredit their testimony and minimize the significance of the evidence they had preserved. David understood that their safety would depend on continued international attention and support that might diminish over time. Rosa's coordination of international journalism efforts had created a network that was now investigating similar conspiracies in other conflict zones around the world. Their personal crisis had become the foundation for broader accountability efforts that were examining how corruption and violence intersected to create profitable conflicts that devastated civilian populations while enriching criminal networks. Dr. Santos's work with trauma survivors was expanding to include other witnesses and victims who were coming forward as a result of the global attention generated by their case. Her expertise was proving essential for ensuring that testimony could be provided effectively without re-traumatizing survivors who had already endured more than most people could survive. The compound security arrangements reflected lessons learned from their harrowing escape, while also demonstrating international commitment to protecting witnesses regardless of the resources deployed against them. Multiple layers of protection included both physical security and diplomatic immunity that would make any attack an international incident with serious consequences for the perpetrators. Miguel's adaptation to their new circumstances demonstrated the resilience that had carried him through the loss of his mother and the dangers of their escape. His relationship with Esperanza and baby Luz had created a family structure that provided emotional stability while also giving him purpose as he continued documenting stories that would be essential for future accountability efforts. Baby Luz's recovery in the secure medical facility symbolized hope for healing and growth, despite the trauma that had shaped the first months of her life. Her presence continued to inspire everyone around her while representing the possibility that future generations might grow up in a world where children were protected rather than exploited by adults pursuing wealth and power through violence. The International Tribunal chamber in Geneva fell silent as Esperanza approached the witness stand, her footsteps echoing in the vast space designed to hold history's most significant testimonies. 6 months had passed since their desperate escape from the warehouse siege, and the young woman who now carried herself with quiet dignity bore little resemblance to the terrified child soldier who had given birth in an abandoned gas station. Baby Luz slept peacefully in David's arms in the gallery, her presence a visible reminder of hope born from the darkest circumstances. The prosecution team had spent weeks preparing Esperanza for this moment, but David could see in her posture the same determination that had carried her through military service, pregnancy, childbirth, and their harrowing flight to safety. Dr. Santos sat nearby, her presence providing psychological support that had proven essential during the months of preparation for testimony that would reshape international understanding of modern warfare and corporate accountability. Miguel occupied a chair next to Rosa, both of them documenting proceedings that would become historical records of unprecedented scope. The boy had matured dramatically during their ordeal, his natural intelligence sharpened by experiences that had taught him how individual courage could create ripple effects extending across continents and generations. His photographs and videos had become crucial evidence supporting the testimony that was about to unfold before judges representing dozens of nations. The defendants included military commanders, government officials, corporate executives, and rebel leaders whose conspiracy had maintained profitable conflicts for over a decade while destroying countless lives. David studied their faces as Esperanza took her oath, seeing in their expressions the arrogance of people who had never imagined being held accountable for crimes they had committed with impunity for years. Their presence in the dock represented a victory for international justice that had seemed impossible when he first encountered a pregnant girl seeking shelter from a storm. Esperanza's testimony began with her childhood in mountain villages where government forces and rebel groups had competed for control of strategic resources while terrorizing civilian populations caught between them. Her voice remained steady as she described the morning when soldiers had arrived at her school and forced children as young as 10 to choose between military service and watching their families suffer violent reprisals. The judges listened with visible emotion as she explained how children were systematically separated from their communities and transformed into weapons against their own people. The technical evidence from the micro SD card had already been presented during weeks of preliminary hearings, but Esperanza's personal testimony gave human context to statistics that might otherwise have seemed abstract to international audiences. She described training methods designed to break children's psychological resistance while building their capacity for violence, medical experiments conducted on young soldiers without their consent, and punishment systems that used torture to maintain discipline within military units composed primarily of minors. David felt his throat tighten as Esperanza recounted her pregnancy and the cruel calculations that had led commanders to use her condition as cover for intelligence operations. Her description of carrying vital evidence while experiencing the physical and emotional challenges of pregnancy highlighted the intersection between gender-based violence and systematic war crimes that prosecutors were working to establish as new categories of international law. Dr. Santos had worked extensively with Esperanza to develop testimony techniques that would allow her to communicate her experiences clearly without becoming overwhelmed by traumatic memories. The psychological preparation showed in her ability to maintain composure while describing events that would devastate most adults, her military training providing emotional discipline that served her well in the formal environment of international legal proceedings. The defense attorney's cross-examination revealed the sophisticated legal strategies that powerful defendants could deploy even when facing overwhelming evidence of their crimes. They attempted to discredit Esperanza's testimony by questioning her age, mental capacity, and motivations while suggesting that her experiences had been exaggerated or misunderstood. David watched with pride as the young woman calmly refuted their arguments, her responses demonstrating intelligence and integrity that made their attacks backfire spectacularly. Miguel's documentation had captured moments during their escape. That provided powerful visual evidence supporting Esperanza's verbal testimony. His photographs of destroyed villages, displaced families, and environmental damage caused by prolonged conflict created an evidentiary record that complemented official reports while providing perspectives that adult journalists might have missed. The international media had embraced his work as representing a new generation's commitment to truth-telling and accountability. Rosa's investigative reporting had evolved into comprehensive analysis of how the conspiracy they had exposed connected to similar networks operating in conflict zones around the world. Her articles were influencing international policy discussions while providing blueprints for investigations in other regions where corporate interests and military violence intersected to create profitable chaos at the expense of civilian populations. The tribunal proceedings represented more than individual accountability for specific crimes. They were establishing legal precedents that would reshape international law regarding corporate responsibility for conflict-related violence and the protection of child soldiers. Esperanza's testimony was contributing to jurisprudence that would affect how future conflicts were prosecuted and potentially prevented through stronger international oversight mechanisms. Baby Luz had become an unofficial symbol of the proceedings, her presence in the gallery reminding everyone that the abstract legal concepts being debated had immediate human consequences for real families. International media coverage frequently featured images of David caring for the infant while her mother provided testimony that would protect other children from experiencing similar exploitation and violence. The months of preparation had strengthened the bonds between their unlikely family while also revealing new dimensions of each person's character. David had discovered leadership abilities he hadn't known he possessed. Miguel had developed into a skilled documentarian and advocate. Esperanza had found her voice as someone whose experiences could create positive change, and Dr. Santos had refined therapeutic techniques that were being adopted by other professionals working with trauma survivors. The international protection program that had evolved around their case was serving as a model for similar efforts in other regions where witnesses faced comparable threats from powerful criminal networks. David's experience coordinating their protection had made him a sought-after consultant for organizations working to develop witness security protocols that could operate effectively across multiple jurisdictions while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid response to changing threats. Esperanza's testimony concluded with her vision for future generations who might grow up without experiencing the violence that had shaped her own childhood. Her description of baby Luz's potential to live in a world where children were protected rather than exploited created a powerful emotional climax that left few observers unmoved. The young mother's transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated the healing power of justice while inspiring others who had survived similar experiences to find their own voices. The verdicts, when they finally came, exceeded even the most optimistic predictions of the prosecution team. Multiple defendants received lengthy prison sentences while others faced asset forfeiture that would cripple their ability to finance future criminal operations. More importantly, the tribunal's findings established legal precedents that would make similar conspiracies more difficult to organize and maintain, while providing stronger protections for witnesses willing to testify against powerful interests. David found himself processing emotions that ranged from profound relief to unexpected grief as he contemplated how much their lives had changed since that stormy night when they first encountered Esperanza. The mission that had begun with a simple decision to help someone in need had evolved into an international movement for accountability that was already generating positive changes in conflict zones around the world. Miguel's work documenting their experience had attracted attention from educational institutions that were developing new curricula about human rights and international justice. His photographs and videos were being used to teach students about how individual actions could create broader social change while demonstrating that young people possessed capabilities for leadership and advocacy that adults often underestimated. The secure community where they had been relocated included other witness families who had faced similar threats while contributing to accountability efforts in various international proceedings. This environment provided social support that was essential for healing, while also creating opportunities for collaboration between people whose diverse experiences were contributing to broader understanding of how justice could be pursued effectively even when facing powerful opposition. Esperanza's education had resumed under the protection program, with tutoring that would allow her to complete her secondary schooling, while also preparing for potential university studies in international law or human rights advocacy. Her intellectual abilities, sharpened by her experiences and supported by access to quality education, suggested future contributions to global justice efforts that could extend far beyond her role as a witness in current proceedings. Baby Luz's development was being monitored by pediatric specialists who were studying how children could thrive despite early exposure to violence and instability. Her progress provided hope for other families who had experienced similar traumas, while also contributing to research about resilience factors that could inform support programs for conflict-affected populations. Dr. Santos had established a research center focused on developing therapeutic approaches specifically designed for survivors of systematic violence who were participating in accountability proceedings. Her work was attracting international attention while providing practical support for witnesses whose psychological well-being was essential for effective testimony and long-term healing. Rosa's journalism had evolved into a multimedia platform that was training other reporters to investigate complex international conspiracies, while maintaining security protocols that protected sources and witnesses. Her experience coordinating global media responses to their crisis had revealed innovative approaches to information sharing that were being adopted by news organizations working on sensitive stories involving powerful interests. The anniversary of baby Luz's birth was celebrated in their new community with recognition that her survival represented victory over forces that had sought to destroy hope itself. The infant's first steps coincided with news that additional prosecutions were being launched based on evidence and testimony that their courage had made possible, creating symbolic connections between personal growth and broader social progress. David's reflection on their journey revealed transformations that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances to encompass fundamental changes in how he understood responsibility, courage, and the possibility for individual actions to create meaningful change. His decision to help a pregnant girl seeking shelter had evolved into a commitment to protecting vulnerable people that would shape the rest of his life. The international community that had formed around their protection included individuals from dozens of countries who had risked their own safety to ensure that justice could be pursued effectively. These relationships had created networks of mutual support that were proving valuable for other accountability efforts while demonstrating how global cooperation could overcome even well-resourced criminal conspiracies. Miguel's relationship with other young people in their protection community had sparked collaborative projects that were documenting human rights violations while developing advocacy strategies specifically designed by and for young people. His work was inspiring peer networks that were becoming increasingly effective at using technology and social media to support accountability efforts, while maintaining security protocols that protected participants. Esperanza's testimony had inspired other former child soldiers to come forward with their own stories, creating a growing movement that was challenging impunity for crimes against children while building support networks that helped survivors heal from trauma and develop new life possibilities. Her courage in speaking publicly about experiences that many preferred to keep hidden had opened pathways for others to find their voices. The legal precedents established through their case were being cited in accountability proceedings around the world, creating jurisprudential foundations that would strengthen international justice mechanisms for decades to come. The specific circumstances of their experience had generated broadly applicable principles about corporate responsibility, witness protection, and the prosecution of systematic violence against civilian populations. Baby Luz's second birthday was marked by news that the last of the major defendants had been convicted and sentenced, bringing formal closure to legal proceedings that had reshaped international law while demonstrating that even the most powerful criminal networks could be held accountable when sufficient evidence and international support were mobilized effectively. The community garden that had been established in their protection facility included plants from the mountain villages where Esperanza had grown up, creating living connections to cultural traditions that violence had sought to destroy. Baby Luz's delight in exploring these growing spaces provided daily reminders of life's capacity for renewal, even in the aftermath of devastating trauma. David's work with international protection programs had expanded to include training components that prepared other humanitarian workers for situations where simple assistance might evolve into complex accountability missions. His experience had demonstrated that logistics coordinators and relief workers possessed transferable skills that could prove valuable for witness protection and international justice efforts when circumstances demanded such evolution. The scholarship program that had been established in Baby Luz's name was providing educational opportunities for other children who had been affected by conflicts while also supporting research into prevention strategies that could reduce the likelihood of future violence. The program's success was generating additional funding that would expand its reach while creating sustainable support for conflict-affected communities. Miguel's documentation project had grown into an international network of young people who were using multimedia tools to record human rights violations while maintaining security protocols that protected both witnesses and documentarians. His leadership in developing these networks was inspiring similar efforts in other regions, while demonstrating young people's capacity for sophisticated advocacy and protection work. Esperanza's completion of secondary education was followed by acceptance to a prestigious university program in international law, where her experiences would provide unique perspectives on legal theories, while her academic performance opened possibilities for future contributions to global justice efforts. Her transformation from child soldier to law student demonstrated healing's potential while inspiring others who had survived similar exploitation. The international symposium that marked the 5th anniversary of their initial meeting brought together representatives from organizations around the world that had been influenced by their experience. The gathering provided opportunities to assess progress in accountability efforts while planning future initiatives that would continue building on foundations they had helped establish. Baby Luz's enrollment in preschool represented normalcy that had once seemed impossible for a child born in an abandoned gas station during a violent storm. Her easy adaptation to educational settings and social interactions with other children demonstrated resilience that provided hope for all families recovering from conflict-related trauma. David's reflection on their journey revealed patterns that connected personal healing with broader social change in ways that exceeded anything he had imagined possible when he first decided to help someone seeking shelter. The ripple effects of individual courage had created waves of accountability that were reshaping international institutions while providing models for future efforts to pursue justice even when facing powerful opposition. The legacy of their experience continued expanding as new generations of advocates learned from their example while developing innovative approaches to protection and accountability that built on lessons learned during their harrowing journey. From desperation to hope, their story had become proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose courage over comfort and justice over safety. The university campus buzzed with excitement as hundreds of delegates from around the world gathered for the inaugural Global Youth Peace Summit, An event that had grown from Miguel's simple idea to create a platform where young people could share their experiences with conflict and develop solutions for preventing future violence. Now 22 years old, Miguel stood at the podium overlooking an auditorium filled with survivors, advocates, and leaders who represented the next generation's commitment to building a more just world. Esperanza adjusted her graduation cap as she prepared to deliver the keynote address, her law degree from Cambridge representing a journey that had taken her from child soldier to international human rights advocate in just over a decade. At 26, she commanded respect in academic and policy circles, while maintaining the fierce determination that had carried her through unimaginable hardships. Baby Luz, now 10 years old and fluent in 4 languages, sat in the front row next to David, her bright eyes reflecting the intelligence and compassion that marked her as her mother's daughter. David watched from the audience as the two young people he had helped raise transformed their personal experiences into a movement that was reshaping how the international community approached conflict prevention and post-war recovery. His hair showed gray at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of years spent coordinating protection programs for witnesses and survivors across multiple continents. The simple logistics coordinator who had once sought shelter from a storm had become a recognized expert in international witness protection, whose methods were being adopted by organizations worldwide. The summit's opening ceremony featured testimonies from young people who had survived conflicts in dozens of countries, their stories weaving together common themes of resilience, hope, and determination to prevent others from experiencing similar trauma. Miguel's documentary work had evolved into a comprehensive archive that preserved these testimonies while also tracking the long-term impact of accountability efforts on affected communities. Dr. Santos, now in her 70s but still actively engaged in trauma research, presented findings from her longitudinal study of conflict survivors that had been tracking healing patterns and resilience factors over the past decade. Her research had revolutionized understanding of how individuals and communities could recover from systematic violence while contributing to prevention efforts that addressed root causes rather than simply responding to symptoms. Rosa's presence at the summit reflected her transformation from investigative journalist to the director of an international media organization that specialized in conflict reporting while maintaining unprecedented security protocols for protecting sources and witnesses. Her network had been instrumental in exposing additional conspiracies similar to the one they had originally uncovered, creating a global movement for accountability that had fundamentally altered how international criminal networks operated. The afternoon panels focused on innovative approaches to conflict prevention that had emerged from the experiences of summit participants. Young survivors had developed early warning systems that could identify potential violence before it escalated, while former child soldiers had created rehabilitation programs specifically designed by and for people who understood the psychological challenges of transitioning from military service to civilian life. Esperanza's keynote address drew from her recent work with the International Criminal Court, where she had been serving as a special advisor on cases involving crimes against children. Her legal expertise, combined with her personal experience, had made her uniquely qualified to help prosecutors understand the complex dynamics of child recruitment and exploitation while ensuring that court proceedings were sensitive to the needs of young witnesses and survivors. The evening gala featured the presentation of the Martinez Peace Prize, an award established to honor individuals who had demonstrated exceptional courage in protecting vulnerable populations during conflicts. The first recipient was the village healer who had saved baby Luz's life during their mountain crossing, a recognition that brought tears to David's eyes as he remembered the desperate night when they had feared losing the infant who had become a symbol of hope for their entire mission. Baby Luz herself had become an accomplished speaker despite her young age. Her presentation about growing up in a family created by circumstances rather than biology inspiring audiences to reconsider traditional definitions of kinship and belonging. Her fluency in multiple languages reflected the international community that had raised her, while her artistic talent suggested creative approaches to peace-building that complemented the legal and political strategies pursued by the adults around her. The summit's workshops demonstrated practical applications of lessons learned from their experience and similar cases around the world. Participants developed action plans for implementing accountability measures in their own communities, while building networks that could provide mutual support when facing opposition from powerful interests that preferred impunity to justice. Miguel's leadership of the Youth Documentation Network had created unprecedented archives of human rights violations while also establishing protocols that protected young documentarians from retaliation. His work had inspired similar efforts in regions where traditional journalism was suppressed, giving voice to communities that had been silenced by violence and intimidation. The academic symposium that ran parallel to the main summit featured scholarly presentations that analyzed the long-term impact of their case on international law and policy. Legal scholars were examining how the precedents established through Esperanza's testimony had influenced subsequent prosecutions, while political scientists studied the diplomatic innovations that had emerged from their international protection arrangements. David's workshop on humanitarian logistics attracted participants who were working in active conflict zones and needed practical guidance on how to maintain neutrality while also protecting civilians who might become targets for testifying about abuses. His experience had shown that traditional humanitarian principles sometimes required adaptation when dealing with criminal networks that deliberately targeted aid workers and witnesses. The technology exposition showcased innovations that had emerged from their need to maintain secure communications while coordinating international operations. Young entrepreneurs had developed encryption systems and communication platforms specifically designed for human rights work, while others had created apps that could help survivors connect with support services while maintaining their privacy and security. Esperanza's legal clinic was providing free services to survivors who needed assistance navigating international justice systems while also training the next generation of human rights lawyers. Her approach combined technical legal expertise with deep understanding of trauma and cultural sensitivity, creating a model that was being replicated by law schools around the world. The cultural exchange program allowed participants to share traditions and practices from their home communities, while also learning about approaches to conflict resolution that had emerged from different cultural contexts. Baby Luz served as a bridge between these diverse groups, her multicultural upbringing enabling her to communicate across linguistic and cultural barriers that might otherwise have limited interaction. Dr. Santos's therapeutic workshops were teaching participants techniques for processing trauma while also building resilience that could help them continue their advocacy work without being overwhelmed by the emotional challenges of engaging with stories of violence and suffering. Her methods were being adapted for use in post-conflict communities where traditional mental health services were not available. Rosa's media training sessions were preparing participants to engage with journalists and documentary filmmakers while maintaining their personal security and psychological well-being. Her experience had shown that effective advocacy often required public engagement, but that survivors needed specific skills for managing media attention without being re-traumatized by the process. The policy forums brought together government representatives, international organization officials, and civil society leaders to discuss how the innovations demonstrated at the summit could be incorporated into existing institutions and programs. The conversations revealed growing recognition that young survivors possessed expertise that was essential for developing effective prevention and response strategies. The summit's impact extended beyond the immediate participants as live streaming and social media coverage brought their discussions to global audiences, who were following their work and applying similar approaches in their own communities. The ripple effects of their original courage were continuing to expand in ways that exceeded even their most optimistic projections about what might be possible. The closing ceremony featured commitments from participants to maintain the networks and collaborations that had formed during the summit, while also pursuing specific action plans that would advance accountability and prevention efforts in their respective regions. The energy and determination visible in the audience suggested that the movement they had helped start would continue growing and evolving long after the formal proceedings ended. Baby Luz's final presentation included artwork she had created to represent her vision of a world where children could grow up without fear of violence or exploitation. Her drawings and paintings revealed sophisticated understanding of complex social issues while also expressing the hope and creativity that marked her as someone who would contribute to positive change throughout her life. David's reflection on the summit revealed how far they had all traveled from that stormy night when a simple decision to help someone in need had set in motion events that were still generating positive change around the world. The family that circumstances had created had become the foundation for a global movement that was reshaping how humanity approached its most fundamental challenges. The commitments made during the summit's final session included plans for establishing permanent institutions that would continue the work of supporting survivors while also developing innovative approaches to prevention and accountability. Participants left with concrete action plans while also carrying inspiration that would sustain their efforts through the inevitable challenges they would face. Miguel's announcement of plans for expanding the Youth Documentation Network into a full university program attracted support from educational institutions that recognized the need for training programs specifically designed for human rights work in dangerous environments. His vision combined technical skills with ethical training and psychological support that would prepare the next generation of advocates for the realities they would face. Esperanza's acceptance of a position with the United Nations Special Commission on Child Protection represented recognition of her expertise, while also providing her with platforms for advancing policy changes that could prevent other children from experiencing the exploitation she had survived. Her appointment was seen as a victory for advocates who had argued that survivors should play leadership roles in designing prevention and response strategies. The scholarship program that had been established in Baby Luz's name announced its expansion to include participants from every region represented at the summit, creating educational opportunities that would enable young survivors to develop skills necessary for leadership roles in their communities. The program's success had generated additional funding while also inspiring similar initiatives in other contexts. David's announcement of plans to establish a permanent international training center for humanitarian protection workers attracted support from organizations that had benefited from his expertise, while recognizing the need for institutionalizing lessons learned from their experience. The center would provide training that combined practical skills with ethical foundations necessary for effective work in challenging environments. The summit concluded with recognition that their work was far from finished, but that the foundations had been established for sustained efforts that would continue building on their achievements, while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The movement they had helped create was now large enough and diverse enough to continue growing, even when faced with opposition from powerful interests that preferred the status quo. The final evening brought together participants for informal conversations that revealed the personal connections and friendships that had formed during their time together. These relationships would provide ongoing support for individual advocates, while also creating networks that could respond quickly to emerging crises and opportunities for positive change. Baby Luz fell asleep in David's arms as the summit's final session concluded, her peaceful expression reflecting the security and love that had surrounded her throughout her young life. Her presence had reminded everyone that their work was ultimately about protecting innocence and creating possibilities for future generations to experience the safety and opportunities that should be every child's birthright. The memorial garden overlooked the valley where their journey had begun 15 years earlier, its carefully tended pathways winding between monuments that honored those who had lost their lives to the conflicts that once ravaged this region. David stood beside the newest addition to the garden, a simple stone bench dedicated to Maria's memory, finally able to honor his late wife's legacy in the place where everything had changed for their family. Esperanza walked slowly through the garden with her 3-year-old son Carlos, pointing out flowers that grew alongside indigenous plants from the mountain villages where she had spent her childhood. The boy's laughter echoed across the peaceful landscape as he chased butterflies that had returned to a region once poisoned by chemical weapons and scarred by endless violence. His presence represented the continuation of hope that had begun with his sister Luz's birth in far more desperate circumstances. Luz herself, now 15 and preparing for university entrance examinations, sat sketching the garden's newest section, where former enemy commanders had worked together to plant trees, representing their commitment to reconciliation. Her artistic talents had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how visual imagery could communicate complex ideas about forgiveness and transformation that words alone could never capture. Miguel directed the installation of the final sculpture in the memorial series, his documentary about the garden's creation having won international recognition while inspiring similar reconciliation projects in other post-conflict regions. At 30, he had established himself as a filmmaker whose work bridged artistic expression with advocacy, creating narratives that helped audiences understand how ordinary people could generate extraordinary change through persistent courage. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of participants from around the world, including former child soldiers who had found new purposes as teachers, farmers, and community leaders in the reconstructed villages that dotted the valley. Their presence demonstrated the healing power of justice combined with economic opportunity, showing how accountability efforts could create foundations for sustainable peace rather than simply punishing past crimes. Dr. Santos, now retired but still actively mentoring young therapists who worked with conflict survivors, delivered remarks that reflected on how trauma could be transformed into wisdom when supported by appropriate healing environments. Her research had influenced therapeutic approaches worldwide, while proving that even the most severe psychological wounds could heal when individuals were surrounded by communities committed to their recovery and growth. Rosa's coverage of the ceremony represented her final assignment before retiring from active journalism, her career having spanned 3 decades of conflict reporting while establishing new standards for protecting sources and witnesses. The media organization she had built continued operating under younger leadership, maintaining her commitment to truth-telling while adapting to technological innovations that made both reporting and protection more sophisticated. The economic development projects that had transformed the region provided concrete evidence of how peace dividends could benefit entire populations when reconstruction efforts prioritized community needs over external interests. Former fighters had learned new skills through vocational programs, while contributing to infrastructure projects that created employment opportunities for thousands of families who had previously depended on conflict-related economies for survival. David's speech at the ceremony reflected on how individual acts of compassion could generate systemic changes that outlasted the people who initiated them. His work coordinating international protection programs had helped hundreds of witnesses testify safely while contributing to accountability efforts that had reshaped international law and policy. The training center he had established continued preparing humanitarian workers for complex missions while honoring ethical principles that prioritized human dignity above institutional convenience. The agricultural cooperative that Esperanza had helped establish through her legal work provided sustainable livelihoods for former combatants, while also creating food security that had been impossible during years of conflict. Her expertise in international law had proven essential for navigating complex property disputes while ensuring that reconciliation processes addressed underlying economic grievances that had contributed to violence. The children's choir that performed during the ceremony included young people from every ethnic and religious group that had participated in the original conflict, their harmonized voices representing unity that had seemed impossible during the darkest periods of violence. Their songs combined traditional melodies from different cultural traditions while also incorporating contemporary compositions that expressed hope for continued peace and prosperity. Luz's artwork was displayed throughout the ceremony venue, her paintings and sculptures capturing both the pain of the past and the possibilities of the future in ways that resonated with audiences across generational and cultural boundaries. Her acceptance to a prestigious international arts program represented recognition of talents that had emerged from circumstances that could easily have destroyed creativity rather than nurturing it. The Technology Pavilion showcased innovations that had emerged from the region's reconstruction efforts, including communication systems that enabled rural communities to access education and healthcare while also providing early warning capabilities for preventing future conflicts. Young entrepreneurs had created businesses that combined traditional knowledge with modern techniques while generating profits that remained within their communities rather than flowing to external investors. Miguel's final interview for his documentary series featured conversations with children who had grown up during the peace process, their perspectives revealing how quickly normalized violence could be replaced by expectations of safety and opportunity when adults demonstrated commitment to different approaches. Their voices provided hope that future generations would not simply avoid repeating past mistakes, but would actively build more just and sustainable societies. Carlos played with other children in the garden's playground area, his carefree interactions demonstrating how quickly trust and friendship could develop when children were protected from adult conflicts, while being taught to value diversity rather than fear differences. His bilingual chatter reflected the multicultural environment that had replaced the rigid ethnic divisions that once characterized the region. The economic indicators presented during the ceremony's educational sessions demonstrated remarkable progress in reducing poverty, improving health outcomes, and expanding educational opportunities throughout the region. These achievements provided concrete evidence that peace was not simply the absence of violence, but the presence of conditions that allowed all people to develop their potential while contributing to community well-being. Esperanza's announcement of plans to establish a legal clinic specifically focused on land rights and environmental justice attracted support from international organizations that recognize the connection between resource conflicts and systematic violence. Her work would help communities navigate complex legal frameworks while also building local capacity for resolving disputes through peaceful mechanisms rather than violence. The memorial's final section honored international supporters who had risked their own safety to provide assistance during the darkest periods of conflict, while also celebrating local leaders who had maintained hope when circumstances seemed hopeless. Their recognition emphasized that sustainable peace required both external support and internal commitment to transformation rather than simply imposing solutions from outside. David's reflection on the memorial garden revealed how dramatically the landscape had changed since that stormy night when he first encountered Esperanza. The abandoned gas station where Luz had been born was now a community health center that served surrounding villages, while also providing training for local medical professionals who understood the specific health challenges faced by conflict-affected populations. The sunset ceremony concluded with participants planting new trees that would continue growing long after current generations had passed away, their roots eventually intertwining to create forests that would shelter future families, while cleaning air and water that had been contaminated by years of violence. The symbolic and practical dimensions of this action captured how individual choices could create legacies that extended far beyond personal lifespans. Luz's final sketch of the day captured her family gathered around Maria's memorial bench, their faces reflecting the contentment that came from honoring their past while building toward a better future. Her drawing included empty spaces that suggested room for growth and new additions, acknowledging that their story continued evolving even as this particular chapter reached its conclusion. The evening reception featured music and dance from every cultural tradition represented in the region, creating celebrations that honored diversity while also building shared experiences that transcended historical divisions. Former enemies danced together while their children played games that required cooperation rather than competition, demonstrating how quickly healing could occur when supported by appropriate environments and expectations. Miguel's conversation with international visitors revealed ongoing challenges that required continued attention while also highlighting successes that provided models for other post-conflict regions. His balanced perspective acknowledged that peacebuilding was an ongoing process rather than a destination, requiring sustained commitment from multiple generations while adapting to changing circumstances and emerging challenges. David's final walk through the memorial garden with his extended family revealed how profoundly their relationships had evolved since those desperate early days when survival had seemed uncertain. The bonds forged through shared danger had deepened into love that transcended traditional family categories, while creating support networks that had proven essential for navigating both personal challenges and professional responsibilities. Esperanza's embrace of her son Carlos, as he fell asleep in her arms, echoed memories of her own desperate flight while carrying baby Luz through hostile territory. The contrast between past terror and present security demonstrated how completely circumstances could change when people chose courage over comfort while building institutions that protected vulnerable populations rather than exploiting them. The stars emerging over the memorial garden illuminated pathways that would guide future visitors through landscapes of memory and hope, their light reflecting off monuments that honored sacrifice while also celebrating transformation. The peaceful scene represented victory over forces that had sought to destroy hope itself, proving that human dignity could survive even the most systematic attempts at dehumanization. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.